Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this subject. As Steve said, my name's Tony Atkinson, and my special interest is in the First Indochina War, fought between the French and the Communist Vietnamese, the Viet Minh Army, or the VPA, also they were called. It's in connection with that interest that the subject of my talk today is a man named James Bernard McGovern Jr., who was popularly known by the nickname Earthquake McGoon. My presentation's not going to be just about McGovern himself. I'll also give a brief overview of the history of the organisations he worked for, the conflicts in which he was involved, and so on. I think he's got an amazing story, and it's really worthy of being made into a movie, and I hope you do too. The painting that you can see on the screen is a Fairchild C119 flying boxcar. It actually was painted for a CIA calendar. This was May 2018, the special picture for that, and you'll find out why a bit later on. Even though I'm talking about aviation, I don't know anything about aviation. I have flown in planes, but that's about it. And I will probably make some errors, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I do. James McGovern started flying as a fighter pilot in the China-Burma-India theatre in the final stages of World War II, and later as a commercial pilot carrying passengers and cargo throughout Asia after the war. If ever someone was larger than life, it was him. The legends about James McGovern are almost unbelievable. And if only half of them are true, he'd have led an incredible life in the 12 years after he left home to join the US Army Air Forces. These are just a few of the stories told about him. He couldn't fit into regular pilot seats, so he replaced them with a big wicker chair. If you look at the Old Fliers Group YouTube channel, you'll see that Steve posted a video a couple of weeks ago about does size matter? He was talking about a test pilot who was very small and slim. Well, in this particular case, size didn't matter at all. James McGovern was about 300 pounds. His backside was so big, he usually sat on 2 bar stools at the bar. He always landed tail high because he couldn't pull the control stick back past his stomach. He once flew his flying boxcar for more than an hour on trim tabs alone because anti-aircraft fire had knocked out his elevator control. It was apparently like a kangaroo hopping all the way back to base. He rarely carried maps with him when he flew. He brewed moonshine from rice using a still made from scavenged parts from wrecked planes. His Curtiss C-46 was shot at by 2 Soviet P-39 Aerocobras. He won a troop of Russian dancing girls in a poker game. He was actively involved in raising funds for Chinese orphans and other acts of goodwill. He would stuff his pockets with peanuts just before a mission and fill the cockpit with their shells. He drank a case of beer on one mission and tossed the empty bottles onto communist Chinese troops on the ground. When he was captured by Chinese communist guerrillas, he aggravated them so much they let him go after 6 months. He opened his mail while he was flying and tossed his unpaid bills onto the Viet Minh troops at Dien, and so on. Are all the stories true? It's unlikely, but I'll try to disentangle the man from the myth. You can see from the photographs that he was a very big boy. James B. McGovern was born on February the 4th, 1922 in Elizabeth, New Jersey. All he ever wanted to do growing up was to fly. When he was 7 years old, his family went to Pittsburgh for a family vacation. James went missing. Mother didn't worry though, because she knew where he'd be. He was at the airport, leaning on the fence, watching the planes come and go. As he grew older, he spent all his pocket money on flying magazines, of course. He left high school in 1940 and entered the Casey Jones School of Aeronautics. I think it's now called the Vaughan College of Aeronautics near LaGuardia Airport. He graduated as a mechanic and went to work for as a testing engineer for the Wright Aeronautical Company, which eventually became the Curtiss-Wright Company, developer of the P-36 Hawk, P-40 Warhawk, and the C-46 Curtiss Commando, among others. And I've shown those on the left-hand side. As soon as the US entered the war in December 1941, James went down to the US Army Air Force's recruiting centre, got his enlistment papers. On his 20th birthday, a couple of months later, he took the papers to his parents and said, "This is the only birthday present I want." They signed, and on April 6, 1942, he was sworn in. His first brush with death came at Williams Field in Arizona, when he was training as a reconnaissance pilot. As he was bringing his plane in for a landing, the cockpit broke and flew off, hit him in the face, breaking his jaw. He retained consciousness though, and brought the plane in for a perfect landing. McGovern arrived in China in late 1944 and joined the 75th Fighter Squadron of the 23rd Fighter Group of the 14th Air Force. The Kai-Shek Squadron of Curtiss P-40 Warhawks was the successor to Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers. I'll speak more about them later. The Flying Tigers were the men of the first American volunteer group who flew in China just before the Americans joined the war. During his time in the China-Burma-India theatre, McGovern was credited with shooting down 4 Japanese Zero fighters and destroying 5 on the ground. He also flew with the 118th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron, known as the Black Lightning Squadron, and you can see on the photo of the aeroplane there, it has a black lightning flash on the tail of the plane, and that was that particular squadron. I've been able to track down photos of McGovern at various places throughout China. On the left, top left, you can see he's squatting on the plane, and there are 4 victory markings, Japanese flags, on the plane. And there's a P-51 in a revetment on the right-hand side. And again, this is Sichuan in China. He was also at various other bases in China. As the war ebbed and flowed, the Americans were able to fly to bases in the east of China, and then in 1945, as the Japanese were not quite retreating, but they did take over some of those bases in the east, and so the Americans had to go back to bases such as Chenault again. And we can see our hero in the 4th from the left. He's a bit chunky, but he's not overly big there. 4th from the left next to the propeller. Another photo, this time James is sitting on the ground, and he's first row on the left. I haven't found too many photos of him smiling. I don't know whether the fractured jaw that he got from the broken cockpit stopped him from smiling, or he just didn't like photos, but you can see he's sort of scowling there. Again, another couple of photos, and he is, this is in February 1945. He's 4th from the left in the back row, on the left-hand side, and then he's hiding behind the elbow in the middle of the photo on the ground in the photo at the right. The next slide, I took this photo of a P-40 Warhawk at the World War II Museum in New Orleans in Louisiana, and it's a fantastic museum. I don't know if you've ever been there, but I recommend, if you get the opportunity, to go. And it's a bit of a nod to the next slide, which I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail. Somebody who I'm sure many of you know. General Claire Chennault. He was born in 1890, or 1893. He lied about his age, I think, to get into the army at one stage. He grew up in Louisiana. He, after trying his hand at various jobs, he was commissioned as a first lieutenant in the Infantry Reserve in November 1917. He was rejected for pilot training, but obtained a transfer to the Signal Corps Aviation Section. Chenault learned to fly by asking friendly pilots to train him. He was about to be shipped off to Europe, but the armistice was declared and they were marched back into barracks. He then contracted Spanish flu, a very, very bad case, and was sent to a palliative care ward where others were expected, well, most of the people that were sent there were expected to die. But luckily he survived, thanks, he said, to a bottle of bourbon that a friend brought him. He was then accepted for pilot training after 3 rejections and already had 80 hours under his belt, and he was awarded his fighter pilot rating in 1919. Chenault commanded the 19th Fighter Squadron from 23 to 26 in Hawaii, where he developed a range of pursuit tactics for fighter pilots. And back in the US mainland, he developed a combat technique in which paratroopers would jump from the rear seat of a de Havilland biplane, and another plane would drop the men's equipment. However, the Army Chief of Staff, General Summerall, after watching a demonstration, turned around and walked away snarling, "More of this damned aviation nonsense." At a later show put on for a visiting Russian military mission, Chenault was asked by the Russians to go to Russia and develop paratroop capability there. He was offered the rank of colonel, allowed to fly any plane he liked, but he kept putting them off until they lost interest. Throughout his career, he found ways of irritating his superiors. One aspect of the disagreement was over the role of fighters against enemy bombers. Many believed that fighters couldn't be scrambled fast enough to take on incoming bombers. And Chenault argued that an effective early warning network would allow fighters to intercept bombers before they had time to reach their targets. This was the basis of his theory of defensive pursuit, and he allied this with the theory of fighters accompanying bombers on their missions. It wasn't a popular view at the time, and he also emphasised the importance of teamwork and formation flying. He taught pursuit tactics and performed in an army aerobatics troupe known as 3 Men in Their Flying Trapeze. That's a photo on the right. In fact, I think he was sort of shipped off to that aerobatics troupe, but they travelled around America giving aerobatics displays. 2 of his troop members took an early discharge from the army and went to work in China, training pilots for the Chinese Air Force. By 1937, Chenault had had enough. 20 years in the US Army Air Corps, he was grounded because he was deaf from flying in open cockpits, had chronic bronchitis, he smoked as well, low blood pressure, physical exhaustion and depression. He was then approached by a Chinese Air Force general who asked him to come to China and evaluate the Chinese Air Force. At the time, of course, the Chinese Air Force was battling against Japanese bombers and fighters because the Sino-Japanese War had already started at that stage. Chenault accepted and went to China with the rank of colonel. He became very close to the leader of the nationalist Chinese at the time, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-Shek, and his wife Su Mei-ling, who's known as the mother of the Chinese Air Force. When Chenault got to China, he found that it was mostly Italians training the Chinese. There was a lot of competition in the 20s and 30s to sell planes to the rest of the world, and the Italians were quite vigorous in China. And they were training pilots as well. Now, Chenault evaluated the Chinese Air Force and found that the Italians were passing everyone, regardless of their ability. He also found that the Italians weren't keeping a proper register of the planes that the Chinese Air Force had. Chiang Kai-Shek thought they had 500. In fact, Chenault found they only had 91. It was a bit like asking a consultant to come and do some work for you. I think he may have gilded the lily a bit. After Japan attacked several important Chinese cities in 1937, Chenault was appointed Director of Combat Training for fighter groups. He worked with the Chinese Air Force for 3 years, and then he began to lobby the US government, saying, look, you're not part of this war, but perhaps we could get some American pilots to come to China and serve there to fight against the Japanese. The American government wasn't particularly keen, but they eventually relented. And so the men of the American volunteer group, comprising 109 pilots and 150 mechanics, known as the Flying Tigers, worked in China. They were flying P-40s from December 1941 through to July 42. Of course, December 7th, 1941 was Pearl Harbor, and after that, of course, upon that, America declared war. And in mid-1942, those Flying Tigers were given the opportunity to join the US Air Force. Most of them accepted, some of them didn't. Their planes had the distinctive shark face, and I understand that the shark face was copied from a British group, the number 112 Squadron RAF in North Africa. Had adopted the shark face, and they saw it on German Bf-110 Messerschmitts. So that's where the shark face comes from. The American volunteer pilots were credited with destroying nearly 300 Japanese planes. Of course, once war was declared, Chenault was recalled to active service as a colonel, and in the China-Burma-India theatre. He spent the rest of World War II as head of the 14th Air Force in China, and the Flying Tigers, they adopted the name of the volunteer group, were really quite instrumental in attacking Japanese planes and important facilities. They're credited with the destruction of 2,315 Japanese aircraft and many other important pieces of infrastructure. After the war, Chenault went back to China and stayed there until the 1950s as founding president of Civil Air Transport, or CAT, C-A-T, a commercial airline he co-founded in China with a lawyer, Whiting Willauer. The story of civil air transport became central to McGovern's life. So Civil Air Transport was formed to transport UN rehabilitation supplies throughout China. Of course, China after the war, after the Second World War, was then in the throes of a civil war between the communists and the nationalists. So it wasn't an easy place to work in. But McGovern was flying for Civil Air Transport. He usually logged over 100 hours a month, making about $1,200, which was a princely sum for a young fellow, a young bachelor in post-war China. McGovern's greatest failing was laziness. An excellent airman, when he put his mind to the task, he had sloppy habits that drove Czech pilots to distraction. One of them wrote this: "Pilot is very lazy and has to be told to do all of his duties," one captain complained. Another captain reported after a route check with McGovern on June 23, 1948, "This pilot went on his Czech ride without so much as carrying a map or letdown procedure. By a quirk of luck, he flew close enough to Taiwan to locate the town. I would not call this confidence, but stupidity. I assume he flies all the time without standard equipment. He is a very lazy pilot and takes much for granted. He definitely isn't responsible enough to be a good captain, and unless he overcomes this attitude, I recommend he be given more co-pilot time." McGovern had joined CAT, Civil Air Transport, which quickly developed over the next couple of years to be the world's largest cargo operation. There was a lot of cargo to be shipped around China, and CAT would handle almost anything from sheep and goats to tungsten, tin, all sorts of minerals were needed. They did have a lot of troubles, of course, because there were other competing airlines in China, but McGovern's connections with Chiang Kai-Shek, the nationalist Chinese leader, were very important. But of course, around about this time, as I said before, the Chinese Civil War was occurring. Mao Zedong's communists were fighting the nationalists, and the nationalists were losing. And so his Civil Air Transport's future was irrevocably bound up with that of the nationalist Chinese. So as the nationalist Chinese were moved from one capital to another around China as the communists took over their cities, Capt also had to move with them. The Capt pilots used to say, we get shot at, but we can't shoot back. The eventual home of the nationalists was Formosa, the island of Formosa, which we know as Taiwan today. And Capt ended up having its home base on Formosa as well. James McGovern never had to go out of his way to get shot at. In 1948, he was carrying some government officials from McGoon to Tsingtao, flying a C-47. And he was attacked by two Bell P-19 Airacobras bearing red star markings like this. The P-39s fired 5 bursts apiece at him without putting a single bullet into him. When reporters pressed him for details, the typically laconic reply was, they shot at us and they missed. I was quite fascinated when I was reading about the Airacobra, and I imagine most of you know its history as well. It was the aircraft type that recorded the most kills of any aircraft type in the Second World War. And it wasn't British airmen, it wasn't US airmen, it was Soviet airmen. The Soviet Union took 4,719 Airacobras from the US and the UK. And they tamed it. I think there were a number of problems. It tended to go into a flat spin quite easily. The Soviet pilots were able to fly it fairly well. I think the big problem with the Airacobra as far as the US was concerned and the UK was that it didn't perform at high altitudes. And if you think about the difference in the fighting conditions between the Allies in Europe and the Russians in the Eastern Front and so on, the Russians were flying at lower altitudes, so the problem of the high performance at altitude didn't really worry them at all. One of the curious things about the Airacobra is that the engine is mounted centrally behind the pilot, and there's a 3-metre propeller shaft that runs under the pilot's legs to the propeller, and the 37mm cannon that you can see at the front of the plane is actually through the propeller shaft. So it's quite a unique design. It was during this time that McGovern was given his nickname. He was stomping around the barracks one early morning, and one of the other pilots, shaken out of his bed by the noise, said, "Oh, there goes Earthquake McGoon." So who was Earthquake McGoon? Many of you will remember this particular cartoon strip called Little Abner, written by Capt. Started in 1934 and it went through to maybe the 50s and 60s. It went for a long, long time. Little Abner was a resident of Dogpatch, an Appalachian town, and all the men were lazy, no-hopers, and all the work was done by the women folk. And Abner is the tall guy in the middle of the photo, tall, good-looking young fellow, and his love interest was Daisy May Scraggs. Daisy May Scraggs pursued him for years and years and years through the comic strip, eventually getting him to marry her in 1952. The image on the left is of Earthquake McGoon, who lived in the neighbouring town of Skunk Hollow. He was an itinerant wrestler, the dirtiest wrestler in the West. And he was pursuing Daisy May Scraggs as well, and she spent all her time fighting him off. It was made into a movie eventually, and the still I've posted from on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see Earthquake McGoon actually has his name written on his t-shirt. And Daisy May is getting ready for the wedding, and you'll have to watch the movie yourself to find out what happens. Now I want to tell you a story about Capt that it's quite amazing. The city of Dien in China was surrounded by communist forces in April 1948, and Capt was the only contact that the city had. They had local staff operating at the airport at Dien, but they were getting very jittery because the communist forces were shelling them and shooting and so on. They were quite worried. So Capt decided to send in two of their pilots to calm down their jittery staff. McGovern flew the two pilots in, Lou Burridge and John Plank, on the 11th of April. Well, I'm going to mention about 10 names now, you have to remember them all. Lou Burridge and John Plank. After dropping them off, McGovern headed back with his C-47, planning to pick them up the next day. That night, the airfield was overrun by communist Chinese forces, and the men from Capt were trapped. They slipped through the communist lines into the city, where they took refuge in a school with a walled playground. All through the night they heard the enemy loudspeakers loudly blaring their names, demanding that the city give up these foreign devils. They knew where they were hidden. Luckily, the two pilots, Burridge and Plank, were able to get word to Capt where they were hidden. But the trouble with the school playground, it was only 400 feet long, it had a dogleg at one end, and it was surrounded by high buildings. Even if a plane could manage to land, it would have to squeeze between the high buildings on either side and only 8 feet clearance off each wingtip. Any attempt to rescue them would be a crazy proposition, but that didn't worry the Capt colleagues. Capt didn't immediately have any planes available that were small enough to do the job, so they borrowed a Stinson L5 Sentinel. That's a Stinson L5 Sentinel on the right-hand side. The US Marines actually had a base nearby in Tsingtao, and they were told what the situation was. They said, no, we couldn't possibly let you have one of our planes, but conveniently they left a fully fueled Stinson L5 next to the Capt officers, and the fellows took it that night. Well, the Stinson L5, piloted by Richard Krusky, landed successfully and picked up Burridge. Fantastic. However, as they tried to take off, they clipped a wing and crashed, stranding Krusky as well as Burridge. Luckily, both men were unharmed, but now we've got Plank, Burridge and Krusky on the ground. Throughout the night, McGovern and the other Capt pilots circled overhead, dropping flares and empty beer bottles that whistled through the air. The Chinese Communist forces on the ground thought they were delayed action grenades or some kind of problem, so they took cover. Early in the morning, Capt sent in its own Stinson L5 and brought it down by that stage. They successfully flied out Burridge and Krusky, leaving Plank on the ground. Then their luck ran out. The L5 came back, piloted by Edwin Trout, but he nosed over on landing on his second trip and broke the propeller. That left 2 guys on the ground. Marshal Stainer then came in with the Capt's Piper Cub, but landed too hard and cracked up the landing gear, leaving 3 pilots, Stainer, Trout and Plank on the ground. Once again, McGovern and the other Capt pilots had to spend the night overhead unloading flares, beer bottles and the occasional bomb, and dropping a replacement propeller. The next day, April the 14th, saw repairs completed on the damaged Piper Cub, enabling Stainer and Trout to leave. Unfortunately, Capt's chief pilot, Bob Rousselot, who was eager to get in on the action, decided to land in an L5, one of these small planes. Here again, as Steve would tell us, size did matter, because Rousselot weighed about 200 pounds, and there was no way he was going to be able to manage a small plane in a tight 400-foot runway. He couldn't take off with Plank, so he decided instead to, he arrived at the playground, landed successfully, but he knew that he wasn't going to be able to take the other Americans with him because it'd be way too much. So he picked up one of the Chinese radio operators that Capt employed. Plane slowly picked up speed and took off, but crashed into a telephone pole, killing a spectator because people were watching this going on for the 2 days that had happened so far. But it stranded Rousselot. Later that day, Stainer brought the Piper Cub back and allowed Plank to fly out. Krusky arrived in another light plane and took Stainer out, leaving only Bob Rousselot on the ground. Again, we had another night of flares and bombs, and this time the Chinese Air Force joined in, making the communist attackers run for cover. April 15 started poorly when Stainer damaged his aircraft on landing. Krusky arrived in an L5 and rolled it over after landing in the playground. once again stranding 3 pilots after 10 attempts and 6 crashes. When the trapped pilots tried to repair their aircraft, Capt obtained a load of hand grenades and rifle ammunition to drop to the defending troops. The mission nearly ended in disaster when the parachute snagged on the tail of the C-47, sending it into a vertical attitude. Luckily, the parachute shook loose just in time. The pilot's persistence eventually paid off. Stainer and Krusky flew out on 1 repaired aircraft before nightfall on the 15th. Rousselot was finally picked up the next morning, completing the rescue. It's an amazing story. The Capt was in a bit of trouble at this stage because the US State Department wasn't really keen on commercial airlines supplying ammunition and dropping bombs and doing all this sort of stuff in China. And they actually threatened to withdraw the passports of the pilots if they did any of this again. Unfortunately, the city fell to the communist forces a couple of days later. That's Dien. Taiyuan is another Chinese city. This was cut off by communist forces in October 1948, cut off completely by land, so the only way of getting supplies into this city was by air. And so as the communist forces continued to encircle the city more tightly, the airstrip operators had to create new airstrips closer and closer to the city. Capt pilots were part of the airlift that happened next. Over a 6-month period, the city was supplied by air only, and it occurred at the same time as the Berlin airlift. And so this doesn't get the love that the Berlin airlift gets, of course, because it was a larger operation and it was in the West and so on. But it certainly was a big thing for Capt. Capt pilots took more risks than the other pilots. There were other airlines that were helping as well. Most of the other airlines would just drop their cargo by parachutes. But what the Capt pilots did was they would drop half their load by parachutes and then come in hot under fire and just push the cargo out of the doors as they flew along the runway, barely stopping, because that stopped missed drops. Some of the parachuted supplies that were dropped by the other companies were going to the enemy. One of his trips, McGovern C-46, froze up on landing. The engine froze up. Another Capt pilot, John Plank, who we've heard of before, flew in with another C-46. He let McGovern go. Plank stayed behind. The next day, Schwartz, one of the other pilots, flew in with 4 mechanics, changed the engine of the C-46 in record time and flew out. And again, a few days later after this, the city fell to the communist forces. On December 4th, 1949, McGovern was captured. He was flying a C-46 from Kai-Shek Airport in Hong Kong at 5:05 p.m. It's an important time, on an unscheduled direct flight from Hong Kong to Kunming. The plane was carrying a woman and her child who had been refused entry into Hong Kong by the immigration authorities. As he approached Kunming, McGovern turned on his, got to make it my aviation terms correct, he picked up the station's radio beacon on his automatic directional finder, but he couldn't obtain accurate heading information because of the night effect. He turned around, couldn't locate Kunming, so he started to fly southwards towards Hainan Island. Hainan Island is down the bottom of the map there. You can see it's the small island on the left-hand side. However, he was running out of fuel, and with only 40 gallons of fuel remaining, he landed on a sandbar in the middle of a river in Liuqiao, about 100 miles short of Hainan. He was deep in communist territory, and by the time he was out of the plane, the banks of the river were lined with guerrillas. The guerrillas ransomed the woman and the child back to her Chinese husband, but captured McGovern and turned him over to some communist guerrillas, who then made him forcibly march 200 kilometres. But his Unfortunately, he had small feet, even though he was a big guy. He had very small feet and ill-fitting shoes. And after a couple of days of this walking, he sat down and said, "No, not going any further." So the Chinese communist guerrillas picked him up on a stretcher like that and carried him the rest of the way. He was kept captive in a hotel room, allowed out for air only 3 times in 6 months, given a packet of cigarettes a day. Chenault and the State Department tried to organise his release, but they weren't really sure whether he was dead or alive until he smuggled a note out through one of his crew members. The poor diet affected him greatly. The amount of food necessary for a Chinese officer wouldn't even get his saliva flowing, so he lost a lot of weight. 6 months after being captured, the gaunt, bearded McGovern was released and reached Hong Kong on May the 31st. Stories soon circulated that the communists had released him because they found him too difficult to handle. It seems unlikely, but there's no other adequate explanation, because one of the other Capt pilots that they did capture around about the same time was kept in captivity for 5 years before being released. News of McGoon's capture had been a blow to Cap's morale. A gloom hung over the pilot's favourite hangout, Jingle's restaurant in Hong Kong. Edward Francis Jingle, better known as Pop Jingle, he's the guy on the top right-hand side, you can see there, was what you might call a colourful character. He owned various hospitality venues in Hong Kong, and his life was the inspiration for one of the characters in the 1954 novel Soldier of Fortune. Some of you remember that. It was turned into a movie with Clark Gable and Susan Hayward. It's a good watch, and you can see the character that it was based on. Soldier of Fortune was written by Ernest Gann, who I'm sure you've read his stories before. Ernest Gann went to Hong Kong to gather material for his novel and ran into Jingle, of course, and he described Jingle as the composite of all the devious and dangerous characters who populated grade B melodramas. And Jingle threatened to have Gann put on the next plane out of Hong Kong. He accused him of being an agent of the US government. Jingle occupied a kind of ambiguous position in Hong Kong. He was a father figure to visiting Americans and American expats, and he also arranged transfers of money, remittances from Chinese expats in the US who were sending money back to their relatives in China. At the time, after the communists took power in China, the US government banned all transfers of money to China. And so Jingle was apparently involved in that particular business, a kind of black market business. But his restaurants and bars were a home away from home. Pot roast, corned beef and cabbage, pitchers of cold American beer, jukebox with cowboy ballads and the latest basketball scores. He was described as a benign, balding Buddha with sagging jowls and a mighty paunch, the only waistline in the Far East that exceeded McGoon's. He used to, sounds crazy, but they used to have belly bumping competitions. And you can see on the photo on the bottom right-hand side, I believe that the guy on the right is Earthquake McGoon, pushing out his stomach. I'm pretty sure it is him. The cartoon in the middle is of Jingle when he was in the Stanley internment camp, when the Japanese invaded Hong Kong and occupied Hong Kong. They interned all British and American citizens in the area. The British were kept there. The Americans were repatriated, but Jingle refused. He stayed with the British and the Australians and the other people in the internment camp. He was cooking for them, and he used his contacts in the local community. He had actually married a very young Chinese woman a few years before, and socially that was a no-no at the time, but he had strong ties in China as a result. Whenever McGovern was off duty, he would come to Hong Kong, eat and drink at Jingle's bar, and then go home with a leg of ham or a jug of chili con carne or something like that to keep him happy. And when news reached Hong Kong of McGoon's capture, Pop Jingle apparently pulled out money out of the bank, mortgaged the bar, took out $100,000 and gave it to Chenault and said, "Get my boy back." After he was released, a bearded and slimmer McGoon pushed his way up to the bar at Jingle's and boomed, "Set him up, I've got a half a year's thirst." McGovern took a lengthy home leave before returning to duty in October 1950. When he came back, his friends noticed that he had quite a different attitude. He was, the imprisonment experience had changed him. He was more serious, and his flight checks improved considerably. Chief Pilot Rousselot reported on May the 6th, 1951, "McGovern gave me a nice flight. He has shown much improvement during the last 3 years and has flown many hazardous flights in good order." It was around about this time that Capt, the station manager at Clark Field in the Philippines, composed this poem about McGovern. It's called The Ballad of Earthquake McGoon. From Hong Kong to Shanghai to far off Tibet, this legend is growing with time, of the behemoth creature who flies in the sky, who knows neither reason nor rhyme. His 300 pounds shake the earth when he walks, yet he soars with the grace of a loon. The legend makes claim that this beast from the east is known as Earthquake McGoon. While still a mere lad in his tenderest years, he seemed a precocious young boy who knew nothing of vices like women and beer, to his preacher a true pride and joy. But tales of the easts and the streetcars that ran in an easterly-westerly way sowed dreams of wild oats in our young hero's head. He vowed that he'd go there to stay. So J.B. McGovern cast off all his chains, took the name of Earthquake McGoon. He yearned to carouse on a far eastern plain where he would have plenty of room. He then learned to fly like a bird in the sky with Wee Willie the Don and the rest, and staked out a claim in that far-flung domain and lived with the mandarin's best. The timbered teak floors in the bars that he entered would groan with deep pain at his weight. It pointed his paunch and in thunderous tones say, "Fella up, matey, it's late. This hollowed-out leg that's supporting me now will hold half a keg of your beer. This stomach of mine which protrudes to your bar, I'm certain will hold all the rest." But it looked like the doom of Earthquake McGoon, and we swore he would never come back. When he dead-sticked his plane into Luchow one day, his future looked truly quite black. They threw him in jail and granted no bail. They took both the shoes off his feet. He stomped on the floor and beat on the door for whiskey and something to eat. In fear of their lives, or because of the din from the behemoth creature within, his captors relented and gave him a bottle of rice wine diluted with gin. But they still couldn't feed this ponderous hulk whose temper grew worse by the day, and quaking with fear, they finally released him after 6 months and a day. His ponderous stomach 100 pounds shy and sporting a wonderful beard, he came back to fly once again like a bird and bellowed, "I never was scared. I've eaten them out of their prisoners' fare, drunk all of their rice wine and gin. My eating and drinking have turned back the tide, those bastards just had to give in. So believe what I say, friend, and lend me an ear, to prove to yourself, if you must, that the legend of Earthquake, the stomach and head, heard, is true as a Venus's bust. Go down to Kowloon, to Jingle's back room, and there staring you in the face is this behemoth creature, his hand on his prop, with a smile on his lecherous face. From Hong Kong to Shanghai to far off Tibet, the legend is growing with time, of the behemoth creature who flies in the sky, who knows neither reason nor rhyme. His 300 pounds shake the earth when he walks, yet he soars with the grace of a loon. The legend makes claim that the beast from the east is known as Earthquake McGoon. Although Capt was very active, flying the nationalist Chinese all over the place and flying cargo, they weren't making a lot of money. In fact, they were losing money quite badly, and they really needed some support from somewhere. They approached the US State Department and various other US government bodies asking for help, and eventually approached the CIA and said, "Look, we'll fly for you if you like." The CIA eventually decided to do so, gave them $500,000, and eventually bought the airline outright. So Capt now became a CIA proprietary airline and doing lots of covert missions around Southeast Asia. They also operated this commercial flights as well, from Bangkok through to Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong. I believe they actually flew to New Zealand at one stage as well. And the CIA had a long partnership together until 1959, when CAT was renamed Air America, you've probably heard of. And Air America then took over CAT's activities, covert activities around the world, and eventually was dissolved in 1976. One of CAT's major successes during the Korean War was Operation Booklift. They approached the US Army and Air Forces and said, look, we can supply planes. We've got C-46s and C-47s, and we'd like to supply planes for whatever you need in Korea. They were based at Tachikawa in Japan, and they carried everything from wounded troops back to hospital. From Korea, they carried gold bars, agents, and so on. They had 450 staff, including 30 captains and 55 co-pilots. And they also did covert activities, for example, dropping agents in Korea, Manchuria, and also picking them up. And it also maintained its commercial operations at the same time. Unfortunately, on the 29th of November 1952, CAT suffered a terrible loss when a C-47 with tail number B813 was shot down over Manchuria, killing pilots Norman Schwartz and Robert Snoddy, and abandoning 2 CIA agents to more than 20 years of Chinese prison. John Downey and Richard Fecteau were aboard this C-47 when it was shot down in Manchuria. They were very good in terms of not giving up any information about their operations. They lasted about a year of interrogation before they told the Chinese captors what they were doing. But one was sentenced to life and the other one was sentenced to 20 years, and they weren't released until 1971 and 1973, respectively. And one of the sticking points, which was really interesting, because the Chinese had already repatriated, they'd already liberated American soldiers and American airmen that had been flying in Korea, but the US would not admit that these 2 guys were CIA agents. And because of that, that was one of the sticking points that the Chinese had. I want to show you a brief excerpt from a video called Extraordinary Fidelity, and this tells the story of the 2 agents. The 2 agents were still alive when this video was made. What they did was they were asked to extract an agent from Manchuria using a retrieval system called the Fulton, let's get it right, Fulton Surface-to-Air Skyhook Recovery System. Now, some of you may have heard of that. And basically what you had was you had a C-47 with a hook hanging out the back of it. You've got a guy sitting on the ground with a parachute harness. He's attached to a line, and there's a structure with a line across here. The C-47 flies down really low, grabs the line with the hook, and then yanks the pilot off the ground, and they wind him into the plane. We'll just watch a couple of minutes of this.
The 2nd Unit dropped into Manchuria in July and quickly established radio contact with Downey's CIA base. 2 months later, a Chinese courier was dispatched to gather intelligence.
And the report from the radio said he arrived safely, he's on his mission. The next time the message was that he'd returned from his mission, had much good news to tell, and was awaiting extraction.
The extraction plan called for a plane to swoop down to pluck the courier off the ground. It was an audacious plan, not least because the agency had never tried it before operationally.
And they asked me if I would fly the mission into China. I said, sure. I didn't object at all. We'd come in about 50 feet off the ground with the poles extended from the plane and with a hook on it. And the man that we picked up would be sitting on the ground, facing the plane with a cut-off parachute harness on. And we'd pick him up. He would be jolted off the ground, and then we'd just reel him in. I was running the machine, so right off the bat, bing, no problem. They did it beautifully.
Norman Schwartz and Robert Snoddy volunteered to fly the mission. Both were pilots with Civil Air Transport, a CIA proprietary known simply as Capt. They stepped in after U.S. Air Force pilots withdrew, insisting the aerial snatch maneuver was too risky.
We did it several times, no problem at all. I had nothing but complete confidence in them. I think they had more experience, but I also think they had more balls, if you like, you know.
But it was quite an amazing story. You might have seen similar retrieval systems in other movies. 007 Thunderball, yes. James Bond at the end of the movie is in a little boat with his girlfriend and sends a balloon up, and the plane comes through and grabs the balloon, and they're wound into the plane. The Green Berets, there's another example there. And also in the Batman movie, The Dark Knight, Batman and his captured person are wound up into a Hercules. And there was another in 1962, a really interesting story called Operation Cold Feet. Soviet Russia had abandoned an ice station that was floating on a block of ice, one of their stations, and the CIA wanted to find out what was there, what was left behind. So they dropped a couple of agents on the ice floe who went through the cabin, and they went through all the stuff that the Soviets had, and then they were picked up by this retrieval system. A little bit different, but similar in concept. So between September 51 and 53, McGovern, there in the middle of the photograph, was also working in Vietnam, or French Indochina, as it was known at the time. The Capt had a contract to fly there to support an aid mission that the Americans were running. He was flying about 75 hours a month in Indochina. It involved some covert activities. He was expected to photograph possible landing sites, other areas of interest, and once a month he would go up to Hong Kong, have the aircraft serviced, and go and have fun at Jingle's restaurant. A couple of other missions that Capt was involved in, and particularly McGovern, you can see McGovern in the middle there, was with the nationalist Chinese again. When the communists took over China, the nationalists were pushed out two ways. Some went to the west into Burma, some went to Taiwan, or Formosa. The ones who were in Burma decided that they were going to try and invade China from the west, and the Capt was involved in aiding them. It didn't work, and then in 1953, Capt evacuated some thousands of nationalist Chinese from Burma into Taiwan to great public acclaim. Capt was also involved, and McGovern was flying this in what was called Operation Squaw One. The French weren't having a great time in Laos. They were fighting Viet Minh guerrillas there, and they appealed to the Americans to give them some flying assistance, and the Americans agreed to loan them some Fairchild C-119s, and they hastily painted the French roundels, the France symbol on the side of the plane. They didn't actually take off some of the other stuff though. You can actually see there are two blue stripes on the tail boom of the plane, and that's the original American Blue Flies Squadron symbol. So it was very rushed. The Capt pilots went to Clarkfield in the Philippines, had 72 hours training before they flew these planes. Moving on to 1954, March 1954, McGovern was flying a Cat C-46 on a routine cargo mission from Okinawa to Taipei when he heard an SOS from a US AF C-119 whose 7 crew had ditched in the ocean. There was no one else around, so McGovern flew low below the clouds, dropped a raft to the men in the water, and then stayed in the area until rescue could come. In fact, the Americans didn't come and rescue their own men. The Taiwanese came with a PBY Catalina to rescue them. The next chapter of McGovern's life revolves around the First Indochina War. Now, I won't go through the whole history of it because it's rather long, but essentially I think most of you know that the French returned to Indochina, to Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia after the Second World War. But of course they ran into trouble because Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap, General Giap, and the Viet Minh didn't really want the French there. They were looking, they'd already declared independence and did everything in their power to remove them. Between from 1950 onwards, the French only controlled a very small part of Vietnam. The area around the delta, around Hanoi, and also the Mekong Delta area. All the other parts of Vietnam were controlled by Ho Chi Minh and General Giap's forces. So it was very difficult for them. And by 1953, they recognised that their time in Vietnam was almost over. So the French government told the commanding general at the time to try to engineer a situation that would give them the best opportunities at the negotiating table in Geneva. Geneva peace talks were coming up, and so General Navarre decided to establish a base in far western Vietnam. So if you see there, near the border with Laos, where the word Laos is, there's a town called Dien Bien Phu. And General Navarre decided to establish a base there. He arranged for about 4,500 paratroops to drop in and reoccupy the valley. And you can see it's a long way from Hanoi, and there was no land logistics routes for the French. It was all going to be air supply. The valley of Dien Bien Phu is about 16 kilometres long, about 5 kilometres wide, and is surrounded by mountains up to about 1,000 metres. To drop anything by parachute in the area required planes to go around at least a couple of times, and it is very, very exposed to the heights surrounding the airstrip. I think you can see the airstrip in the diagram on the left-hand side. There's a small black hut, and then there's an airstrip beyond that. On the right-hand side, you can see some circle symbols. Basically what the French did, they eventually had about 10,500 to 12,000 men there. They occupied what they call centres of resistance. They're basically strong point positions. And that was the main camp was in the north. You can see 4 or 5 positions there. The position at the bottom of the map on the right-hand side was called Isabelle. All of these positions had women's names: Anne-Marie, Beatrice, Claudine, Dominique, Eliane, Françoise, and so on. They were apparently the names of the commanding general's girlfriends, but not really. That's the story. Isabelle was a fire base at the bottom of the valley. It had 2 important functions: to protect the main camp towards the north from any incursions by Viet Minh, and it also had a couple of batteries of 105mm howitzers, and those were used to protect the flanks, the eastern flanks of the main position. So they had about 10,500 to 12,000 men there, and many were dropped in during the course of the battle. This is a quick, dirty picture showing the logistics. The red lines are the land logistics routes that the Viet Minh had. Of course, the Viet Minh didn't have an air force. The French had an air force, but not the Viet Minh. Dien Bien Phu is on the far western side. You can see it's about 300 kilometres from Hanoi and about 400 kilometres from Haiphong. If you've been to Ha Long Bay in Vietnam, Haiphong is a port that's quite close to that. And you can see an aircraft carrier out in the ocean there. The French had a couple of aircraft carriers in the region. One was the Arromanche, which used to be the MHS Colossus, a British ship. And the other one was the Bois Belleau, which used to be an American aircraft carrier. So you can see the problem here. The green shaded areas are the parts that the French controlled. They didn't control any of the other areas, and that the airstrip was going to be of complete and utter importance for maintaining this base of 10,000 men in the west of the country. This is what the valley looked like from aerial photos at the time. You can see the airstrip on the right-hand side, and looking back down the valley on the left there. These are some of the planes, or most of the planes that the French had available. You can see the F-6F Hellcat, right from the top, then the Bearcat, Corsair Invader, privateer and helldiver, and you'll recognise that some of those are carrier-borne planes. The Bearcats officially had a range of about 800 miles, and that should have been enough, but they didn't have extended range tanks, and when they were fully loaded, they could usually only loiter in the area over Dien Phu for about 10 minutes. So they basically had to fly from Haiphong or another base, get to Dien Phu, look around quickly for a target, bomb it, and then get back again before they ran out of fuel. A couple of the problems with Dien Phu topographically and meteorologically, of course, is that in that part of Vietnam, there's a fine mist that descends over the valley every morning, and it doesn't lift until about 11 o'clock or lunchtime. So if you want to do any scouting or spotting or any kind of activity, you just can't do it in the mornings. You've got to wait until the mist boils off. The French also had some reconnaissance and transport planes. You'll recognise the plane on the left. It's a MS Criquet, which is actually a German, originally a Fieseler Stork, used in the Second World War, adapted by the French to their conditions. It was almost like a glider in Dien Phu, because Dien Phu itself was at quite a high altitude, and to get over the mountains around the area required these planes to look for thermals. So when they were flying around doing their spotting, they had to use thermals as well. Planes in the middle, our friends, the C-119s, and on the right, the most popular and the most commonly used C-47 Skytrain, the military variant of the DC-3 Dakota. What the French, well, did they know or didn't they know? They really didn't know that the Viet Minh had a suite of anti-aircraft guns. The coloured photograph in the middle is of a 37mm anti-aircraft gun that you can see in the Hanoi Military Museum. The one on the left is a heavy machine gun, a 12.7mm heavy machine gun. The machine gun didn't have a really long range, but the 37mm could reach up to 10,000 feet. So immediately you can see a problem there. If you're parachuting or you're flying into a valley and these guys are positioned, and you can see the dots on the map on the right hand side, they're all anti-aircraft positions. And they're all high, or mostly high, and the planes are trying to come in and land. Essentially what happened after the start of the battle, the airstrip was rendered useless in just a few weeks. So all resupply had to be done by parachute. And of course, with the flak that was involved here, the fact that the Viet Minh were digging trenches and laying siege to the French main position, just like the First World War, meant that the perimeter for dropping supplies was getting smaller and smaller. Now, the Viet Minh were actually using American weapons in many cases, because after the Korean War, the Chinese had captured quite a few American weapons and were bringing them down and supplying the Viet Minh with them. So when the French were misdropping ammunition through parachute, the Viet Minh were collecting the shells and saying, "Thank you very much, we can use those." A very quick idea of the French military aircraft that were lost or damaged. Because the numbers were greatest, of course, the Dakota, 68 Dakotas were hit by flak. Altogether, 158 hit by flak, 14 shot down, 9 missing in action, and 17 destroyed on the ground. The Americans came to the rescue of the French once again. The French put up their hands and said, "We need help." So the Americans decided to offer Capt pilots and some C-119s. The photo in the middle is of a C-119 with McGovern at the controls. And on the right-hand side, you can see him with his backside spread over 2 bar stools. The Americans supplied 37 pilots and many other mechanics as well for the French to use. The Capt pilots all volunteered, including McGovern, and they flew 682 sorties between March the 13th and May the 6th. They had a no napalm clause in their contracts. They said they didn't want to carry napalm or drop it. Napalm was used extensively in the First Indochina War. It wasn't particularly useful in this situation because of the wet monsoon season, which occurred late April, early May, because you can't burn wet vegetation. So up to the end of May the 5th, McGovern had flown 44 missions in support of this operation in Dien. And on May the 6th, he was tasked with flying again, and this time he was going to be flying ammunition to Isabel, the southernmost point. He had a load of 105mm howitzer shells to drop to them. The weather was favourable, the rains had stopped for a while, and there were plenty of planes in the air suppressing the flak. McGovern's co-pilot was Wallace Buford, another American, and the rest of the crew was French. As he eased in for the final run over the drop zone, his wingman, Steve Cusack, suddenly heard his voice over the radio saying, "I've got a direct hit." One of the engines was squirting oil badly, and Cusack saw McGovern feathering it quickly. While serious, the incident wasn't fatal because the C-119 can still fly on one engine. But unfortunately, another 37mm flak shell hit the tail boom, and the plane was badly out of control, with 6 tons of ammunition on board. The crew quickly kicked out the ammunition, and guided by his wingman Steve Cusack, McGovern and Buford struggled for 40 minutes to keep the aircraft aloft long enough to attempt an emergency landing in neighbouring Laos. Tragically, however, a few hundred yards short of their destination, the wingtip clipped a tree, the aircraft cartwheeled, broke in half and burned. McGovern and Buford died, 2 other French paratroopers also died, and a couple of guys survived. McGovern's last words were, "Looks like this is it, son." That afternoon and evening, the Viet Minh launched their final assault on Dien Bien Phu. The French declared a ceasefire, surrendered the next day, and about 9,500 to 10,000 men were taken prisoner by the Viet Minh, marched off 700 kilometres to prisoner of war camps. September that year, about 3,500 were released. The others had perished along the way. Cat aircraft flew to the crash site on May the 7th, but had to leave the area after taking fire, ground fire. This is a photograph that Steve Cusack took of the plane with McGovern in it, and you can see the oil smears on the window from McGovern's engine. On the right-hand side, a photograph of the crash site. Again, another photo of the crash site on the left-hand side, and the Google Earth map on the right. This is the path they took from Dien Bien Phu to Laos. I haven't got to this place yet, but I plan to get there one day. It's very remote. McGovern's death came as a blow to Chenault, who was one of his boys. He wrote an article for Look magazine and was reprinted in the Reader's Digest. McGovern's adventures were so legendary that Time magazine ran an article about his death, and John Wayne called McGovern's parents and asked about buying the movie rights to their son's story. The family turned him down. The photo on the left was taken the day before he died at a bar in Haiphong, and the photo on the right shows Pop Jingle at the funeral service that was held in Hong Kong for McGovern's funeral. And Earthquake's mother said, "Jim was always walking on air. He didn't want to be earthbound like ordinary men." But that's not the end of the story, because in 1959, French officers actually found the wreckage, but the CIA told them to suppress the report. But later, after the Vietnam War, you probably heard of the Joint POW-MIA Accounting Command. There are a number of thousands of American service personnel who were missing in Vietnam and Laos and other parts of Southeast Asia, and this group was tasked with finding their remains or proving that they were dead or otherwise. You can see a villager next to a prop, and that prop is from a C-119, and this group went to Laos several times, eventually finding some remains, which they took back to the United States, and using dental comparisons and a new DNA testing technique. It was a newly developed DNA testing technique. If they didn't have it, they wouldn't have been able to do this. They conclusively identified McGovern's remains. So looking at the timeline, the crash site was first investigated in 1997. The remains were discovered in 2002, returned in December 2002, the DNA analysis done in 2003, but then it took 3 years for the burial to take place because the family was feuding. The nearest living relative of James Bernard McGovern, who was also named James Bernard McGovern III, was his nephew, and his sisters wouldn't give permission for him to be the, what's the term they used? I can't remember the exact term now, but the nearest living relative. So it took several years before the family would allow the remains to be brought home. He was buried in New Jersey, and then a memorial was established in Arlington National Cemetery. The French didn't forget. They awarded in 2005 the Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur, one of their highest awards, to the Capt pilots. At this stage there were only 7 pilots remaining. The photo on the left is of a young French fellow who was actually on the plane and survived. He was a transport officer, and he was thrown out of the plane as it landed and survived. He was captured by guerrillas and kept in captivity for 6 months, and he was only 36 kilograms in weight when he was released. As I mentioned before, civil air transport became Air America, and one of the iconic photos of Air America, this Bell helicopter, evacuating people from Saigon in 1975, is an Air America helicopter. Air America was actually dissolved a year later, so started as Capt in China with General Claire Chenault, and ended after the fall of Saigon. So this is the CIA photo I mentioned for May, the calendar for May 2018. You can see that it's called Earthquake's Final Flight, and the kickers have kicked out the ammunition on parachutes out of the back of the plane after it's been hit. The port engine isn't operating, and the tail boom has a defect as well on it. James B. McGovern packed a huge amount into his life. He only lived for 12 years from the time he joined the US Army Air Corps. He fought directly in World War II. He flew under combat conditions in the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, and the French Indochina War, and very nearly survived all 4. Truly, he's one of the most fascinating characters of Cold War aviation in Asia. And from Hong Kong to Shanghai to far off Tibet, the legend is growing with time of the behemoth creature who flies in the sky, who knows neither reason nor rhyme. His 300 pounds shake the earth when he walks, yet he soars with the grace of a loon. The legend makes claim that this beast from the east is known as Earthquake McGoon. Thank you very much.